Los Alamos, New Mexico, 1943. A 25-year-old physicist sits at a wooden desk while senior scientists argue over a quantum mechanics problem for the third day. They're flipping through textbooks, checking equations, debating interpretations. These are men with decorated careers, PhDs from Princeton, Cambridge, Copenhagen. They've published dozens of papers. They know the literature. Richard Feynman pulls out a blank sheet of paper. 3 hours later, he has the answer. The decorated PhDs are stunned. His secret? He refused to look at a single textbook. While they searched for the right formula, he derived the entire solution from scratch, from first principles. Starting with nothing but the most basic truths physics allows, conservation of energy, symmetry, fundamental particles, he rebuilt the logical pathway to the answer. The method seemed slower. It was actually devastatingly faster. The reason why destroys everything schools teach about learning complex subjects. Most people believe learning faster means reading more, memorizing better, consuming information efficiently. The education system is built on this assumption. Textbooks present knowledge in sequential chapters. Students memorize formulas, definitions, procedures. Exams test recall. The faster you absorb and retain information, the smarter you're considered. This creates a specific type of learner, someone whose intelligence depends on memory, whose speed depends on recognition, whose confidence depends on having studied the right material. It also creates a specific type of anxiety. What if you forget? What if the exam asks something slightly different from what you memorized? What if you encounter a problem the textbook didn't cover? This is why you forget everything you learned within weeks. Why you can ace an exam, but can't solve a slightly different problem 3 months later. Why reading advanced books feels like drowning in symbols you can't connect. The conventional AIM method, accumulation and memorization, creates knowledge that's fragile, dependent, and temporary. Feynman discovered the opposite approach, not accumulation, reconstruction, not memorizing formulas, deriving them, not accepting expert authority, verifying everything against fundamental logic. This method seemed reckless to his professors. It seemed slow to his peers, but it produced something remarkable, understanding so deep that forgetting became impossible. Schools teach you to stand on the shoulders of giants by reading their books. Feynman taught himself to stand on bedrock by rebuilding from first principles. The difference appears when the ground shifts. The memorizer falls. The rebuilder stays standing because his foundation can't be shaken. Documented in James Gleick's biography, Genius, Freeman Dyson described watching Feynman work alongside Julian Schwinger, both solving the same quantum electrodynamics problems. Schwinger would cite 17 papers and hundreds of equations. Feynman would derive the answer from 3 fundamental principles. Same result. One method required a library, the other required only logic. To understand how Feynman actually did this, how he mastered quantum mechanics by refusing to study it conventionally, we need to see what he did at MIT in 1939. MIT 1939. Most graduate students in physics fill notebooks with copied equations from textbooks, Dirac's quantum mechanics, Heisenberg matrices, Schrödinger's wave equations. The standard approach: attend lecture, read the assigned chapter, copy the important formulas into your notes, memorize them for exams. Richard Feynman's notebooks are different. They're blank. Or rather, they start blank. Because Feynman has a rule that seems absurd to his classmates. No formula enters his notebook unless he derives it himself, from scratch, using only the most fundamental principles he can identify. When Professor John Wheeler assigns a quantum mechanics problem, other students flip to chapter 14 of the textbook. Feynman opens to a blank page and writes one sentence at the top. A particle exists. What can I say for certain? This wasn't arrogance. It was methodology. As documented in Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, he described this approach. I had a scheme, which I still use today when somebody is explaining something that I'm trying to understand. I keep making up examples. But these weren't textbook examples. These were examples he built from nothing, testing whether the principle actually held under his own logical scrutiny. If he couldn't derive a formula himself, couldn't trace the logical pathway from fundamental truths to the equation, he didn't write it down. He didn't consider it learned. This meant his notebooks were much thinner than his classmates. Where they had pages of collected formulas, he had pages of derivations. The process looked inefficient. But something interesting happened. When exam time came, other students reviewed hundreds of formulas. Feynman reviewed maybe 20 fundamental principles. But from those 20 principles, he could regenerate hundreds of formulas in real time during the test. While others searched their memory, did the formula have a squared term or a cubed term? Feynman rebuilt the equation from scratch. Logic doesn't forget. The ability to derive doesn't degrade. His classmates were faster initially because they had memorized. But Feynman was faster ultimately because he never had to remember. He could generate any result from first principles on demand. This reveals something critical about how human cognition actually works. When you copy a formula from a textbook, you're borrowing someone else's logical pathway. You can follow it, but you don't own it. The formula sits in your memory as an isolated fact, useful if you remember it, useless if you don't. When you derive the formula yourself, even if you reach the exact same equation the textbook shows, you've built your own pathway. You understand why each term exists, what happens if you remove it, how it connects to other principles. The difference appears when you hit an obstacle. The memorizer searches for which formula applies. The deriver asks what must be fundamentally true, then builds the answer from there. One requires retrieval from deteriorating memory. The other requires only logic from permanent principles. But why did this work when everything about conventional education said it shouldn't? The answer reveals the first principle of Feynman's method. Never accept a conclusion you can't derive from fundamental truths. Not to be difficult, not to prove you're smart, but because derivation creates understanding that memorization cannot. The same principle applies today when you're learning any complex subject: software architecture, financial modeling, statistical analysis, systems design. The conventional approach: watch tutorials, copy code, collect snippets, memorize patterns. The first principles approach: close the tutorial. Start with what you know for certain about how computers process information. Build up from there using only logic. When you're preparing for technical interviews, this means refusing to memorize algorithm patterns. Instead, derive them yourself. Given a problem, ask, what must be fundamentally true about time complexity and data structures? Build the solution from that. You'll be slower initially. Within weeks, you'll be faster than people who've been memorizing for years. Because you can generate solutions, not just recognize them. But there's a problem with this method that almost destroyed Feynman's career. Los Alamos, New Mexico, 1943, the Manhattan Project. Some of the most decorated physicists in the world, Niels Bohr, Hans Bethe, Robert Oppenheimer, are racing to solve weapons physics problems. These men have collectively published hundreds of papers, mentored dozens of students, built the foundations of modern physics. When they make a statement about quantum mechanics, most people accept it as fact. When Bohr explains how particles behave, you listen. You don't question. You certainly don't interrupt. Richard Feynman, the youngest physicist there, questions everything they say, not out of disrespect, out of principle. As documented in Surely You're Joking, even when Niels Bohr, the godfather of quantum mechanics himself, the man who fundamentally changed how physics understands reality, presented an idea, Feynman would interrupt. But why? Bohr's colleagues were shocked. You don't question Bohr. Bohr is the authority. His word is essentially law in quantum mechanics. But Feynman had learned something critical at MIT. Authority is the enemy of understanding. If you can't derive it yourself, you don't actually know it, regardless of who told you, regardless of their credentials, regardless of how many people accept it as true. This created tension. Senior physicists found him arrogant. Why should a 25-year-old demand that Niels Bohr prove basic quantum mechanics? But something strange happened. Bohr started seeking out Feynman specifically, not the senior physicists, the young man who questioned everything. Because Bohr realized Feynman was the only person in the room who would tell him if his reasoning had a gap. Everyone else accepted Bohr's authority. Feynman accepted only logic. Freeman Dyson later wrote about the difference between Feynman and Julian Schwinger, both working independently on the same quantum electrodynamics problems in the late 1940s. Schwinger would reference 15 published papers, cite dozens of physicists, build his proof through a mountain of existing literature. Feynman would reference 0 papers and derive everything from Maxwell's equations and conservation of energy. Dyson noted that Feynman's presentations were harder to follow initially because he built everything from scratch in front of you. But once you understood his derivation, you understood it completely. You didn't need to trust him. You could verify every step yourself. Schwinger's method gave you the answer and asked you to trust the citations. Feynman's method gave you the ability to generate the answer yourself. Here's what Feynman understood that schools never teach. Accepting expert authority without verification creates dependency. When you can't derive the conclusion yourself, you're stuck if the expert is wrong. You're stuck if the situation changes. You're stuck if you need to apply the principle to a new context the expert never addressed. But when you insist on deriving everything yourself, even things everyone knows, even things Nobel Prize winners tell you, you build mental models that are independent, portable, and anti-fragile. They don't break when experts disagree. They don't collapse when you encounter novel problems. They adapt because they are built on logic, not authority. In his Nobel Prize speech in 1965, Feynman stated, "I learned to distrust all experts in a certain way, and I'm very happy with that. I learned that there are theoretical physicists who imagine, deduce, and guess at new laws, but do not know the good old laws very well." This wasn't arrogance. It was epistemological discipline. The refusal to accept conclusions he couldn't personally verify wasn't about proving himself. It was about building understanding that didn't depend on anyone else's word. This reveals the second principle. First principles thinking requires intellectual independence. Verify every claim against fundamental logic, even if the entire field accepts it, even if the person telling you has won every prize physics offers. When you're learning from experts today, online courses, industry thought leaders, technical books, the conventional approach is acceptance. They're credentialed, they're successful, they must be right. The first principles approach is verification. Can I derive this from what I know to be fundamentally true? When someone tells you a marketing framework works, don't memorize the framework. Ask, based on human psychology and basic economics, why would this work? Derive the answer from those foundations. When a coding tutorial shows you a design pattern, don't copy it. Ask, based on how computers process information and manage memory, why does this pattern make sense? Derive the logic yourself. This transforms you from a consumer of knowledge into a generator of understanding. This method gave Feynman independence, but it also gave him something else, something that won him the Nobel Prize. Cornell University, 1947. Feynman is preparing to teach quantum mechanics, the conventional approach for a professor. Review your old notes from when you learned the subject. Follow the textbook structure that's been used for decades. Present the standard derivations students will see in their exams. Feynman does the opposite. He throws away his notes. He throws away the textbook. Every single lecture, he rederives the entire subject from scratch. On a blank blackboard, starting with "a particle exists," he rebuilds quantum mechanics in real time in front of students. His colleagues think he's wasting time. Why rederive what's already perfectly explained in Dirac's book? Why risk making a mistake when you could just present the accepted version? But Feynman discovers something remarkable. Each time he rebuilds from first principles, he finds a simpler path, new insights, better explanations, clearer connections between concepts. By forcing himself to reconstruct rather than remember, he's not just teaching, he's advancing his own understanding. Every lecture becomes a research session. This method, documented throughout the Feynman lectures on physics, is why those lectures became legendary. They weren't summaries of existing knowledge. They weren't polished presentations of settled science. They were live reconstructions of physics from zero, and students could watch the logical architecture being built before their eyes. The numbers are striking. The Feynman Lectures on Physics, 3 volumes, covering everything from basic mechanics to quantum electrodynamics, from thermodynamics to gravitation. Not one single lecture was read from notes. Each was derived live on the blackboard. This seemed slower. Conventional professors could cover more material by presenting pre-written explanations. But here's the paradox. By rebuilding from scratch every time, Feynman eliminated the need to remember thousands of intermediate steps. He only needed to remember 5 or 6 fundamental principles: conservation laws, symmetry principles, the basics of calculus, and linear algebra. From those, he could generate everything else in minutes. While other professors relied on notes and textbooks to avoid mistakes, Feynman relied on logic. And logic never fails if your foundations are sound. When Feynman died in 1988, his Caltech blackboard held one final message left there from his last teaching days. What I cannot create, I do not understand. Not what I cannot memorize. Not what I cannot calculate. Create. This wasn't philosophy. It was method. If he couldn't derive something from first principles, couldn't reconstruct it from fundamental truths using only logic, he didn't claim to understand it, regardless of whether he'd read about it, regardless of whether experts had told him it was true, regardless of whether he could manipulate the equations correctly. Most people approach learning as retention. Read information, memorize it, recall when needed. This creates a fundamental problem. Memory degrades. Within days, you forget details. Within weeks, you forget structures. Within months, you forget most of what you learned. The solution most people choose: review more, reread, use spaced repetition systems, create flashcards. This works to some extent, but it's fighting against the nature of human memory. You're trying to prevent inevitable decay. Feynman used a different strategy: reconstruction. Don't try to remember the thousands of equations and derivations. Remember the 5 or 6 foundational truths. Then rebuild everything else from those when you need it. This sounds slower. It's actually faster, because you're not searching through deteriorating memories, hoping you recall correctly, worrying you forgot something. You're generating fresh derivations from principles that never degrade. Logic doesn't forget. The ability to reason from first principles doesn't rust. This is why Feynman could solve problems in days that took others months. He wasn't retrieving faster from a better memory. He was rebuilding faster because his foundations were unshakable. While others searched their mental libraries for the relevant formula, he derived the answer from scratch in the time it took them to remember where they'd filed it. When you're studying for professional certifications, technical interviews, or career transitions today, the conventional approach is flashcards and practice problems, memorizing patterns and hoping the test matches what you studied. The first principles approach: identify the 3 to 5 foundational principles of the subject. Then practice deriving everything else from those. Preparing for coding interviews: don't memorize 50 algorithm patterns. Master 3 foundational concepts: time complexity analysis, space complexity analysis, and core data structure properties. From those 3, you can derive most algorithm solutions on demand. Studying cloud architecture: don't memorize AWS service names and features. Master the fundamental principles: distributed computing, fault tolerance, and scalability trade-offs. Derive the service designs from those foundations. You'll forget less, understand more, and solve novel problems that memorizers can't touch. These 3 principles, deriving everything from scratch, verifying against fundamental logic instead of accepting authority, and reconstructing from principles instead of memorizing conclusions, combined into something that changed physics. When you combine blank page derivation, rejection of authority, and reconstruction over retention, you get what Freeman Dyson called Feynman's dangerous gift: the ability to rebuild an entire field of knowledge from nothing but logic. This is how Feynman developed his path integral formulation of quantum mechanics and won the Nobel Prize in 1965, not by reading more papers than anyone else, not by memorizing more of the existing literature, by questioning every assumption, deriving from first principles, and reconstructing quantum theory in a way that made sense to him, which turned out to make sense to everyone because it was built on logic rather than convention. But the transformation wasn't just professional achievement, it was philosophical liberation. While other physicists worried about staying current with the literature, reading every new paper, attending every conference, anxiously tracking developments in the field, Feynman never felt behind, because he didn't rely on external knowledge. He could generate it. While others panicked when their memory failed during exams or presentations, Feynman stayed calm. Because he didn't memorize, he derived. While others needed libraries and references and colleagues to verify their work, Feynman needed only a blank page and fundamental truths. The principles were portable. The method was independent. The understanding was permanent. This reveals something critical about intelligence that schools never teach. Speed and depth aren't opposites. They're connected. The deeper your understanding, the closer you get to first principles, the faster you become. Not immediately. The initial learning is slower when you derive everything yourself. But within weeks, you surpass everyone who memorized. Because you're not searching through accumulated facts that may or may not be there. You're generating answers from unshakable foundations. Speed without depth is memorization. Fast initially, but fragile and temporary. Depth without speed is academic overthinking. Rigorous but impractical. Feynman discovered the synthesis. Depth creates speed. Understanding from first principles makes you faster than people with better memory because you never have to remember. You can always rebuild. As Feynman wrote in Surely You're Joking, describing his philosophy to students, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. The conventional education system teaches names, formulas, definitions, procedures, facts. Feynman taught creation, the ability to derive, verify, and reconstruct from fundamental truths. This is the liberation Feynman discovered. You don't need to remember everything. You don't need credentials proving you memorized correctly. You don't need permission from experts. You need logic, fundamental truths, and the courage to rebuild from zero every time. First principles thinking didn't make Feynman faster at learning. It made learning itself unnecessary because he could generate knowledge on demand. While others collected facts like stamps in an album, he collected fundamental truths like seeds. And fundamental truths compound infinitely. One memorized formula is one formula. One fundamental principle generates hundreds of formulas. This is why his blackboard message wasn't what I cannot remember or what I cannot calculate. It was what I cannot create. Creation is proof of understanding. Memory is not. Calculation without understanding is mechanical. Creation requires comprehension. The conventional education system teaches the opposite. Accumulate information, memorize formulas, recall on demand. This creates learners who feel stupid when they forget, anxious when facing new problems, dependent on having studied the right material. Feynman's method creates the opposite. Confidence from understanding, speed from depth, independence from the ability to derive. The question isn't whether you're smart enough for complex subjects. The question is whether you're willing to rebuild them from scratch. Because that's where real understanding lives. Not in the textbook you read, not in the lecture you attended, but in the blank page where you reconstruct from nothing but logic and fundamental truth. The same method that let Feynman master quantum physics applies to cloud computing, machine learning, financial analysis, statistical modeling, systems architecture, any complex domain where schools teach memorization and call it mastery. When you refuse to accept conclusions you can't derive, when you verify against first principles instead of trusting credentials, when you reconstruct from foundations instead of retrieving from memory, you become something different. Not someone who knows more, someone who can generate knowledge, not someone with better memory, someone who doesn't need memory, not someone who learned faster, someone who never has to learn the same thing twice. But Feynman's first principles method was just the foundation. He combined it with a second technique, a cognitive tool for solving impossible problems that he developed at Los Alamos, watching how stuck physicists approached barriers differently than productive ones. It's the reason he could crack problems in hours that stumped entire teams for months. The mental move he discovered changes everything about how you approach obstacles.